Hi, everyone. My name is Cindy McDonald. I am an educator. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm an instructor for the UCLA College Counseling Certificate Program. And this is a series of interviews that I do with experts in subjects we cover, things that are important to us. And I'm so honored and glad to have with me my guest today, Julia Rogers with Enroute College Consulting. And Julia is an expert in many areas, but the topic we're going to talk about today is gap year. So Julia, welcome. I'm glad to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Cindy. I'm excited to talk about my favorite thing, which is gap years.
That makes it kind of easy, right? When it's something you know and love. So tell us a little bit about yourself and why is gap year something that's your favorite thing to talk about?
Sure. So like many people who feel really connected with their work, I had the experience myself in my young life. So I went to college after high school. I went to Hamilton College. And after I graduated from Hamilton, I decided to do a volunteer program. I was thinking about joining the Peace Corps, but ended up working with an NGO where I went to Tanzania in East Africa for about 10 months, doing voluntary service focused around public health outreach. So I was working in a rural school with a Tanzanian counterpart, and together we were teaching health curriculum. We were doing work to do outreach to out-of-school youth around HIV/AIDS prevention and women's empowerment and things like that. And it was a really transformational experience for me, as far as not just the work that I felt that we were doing, which I felt was really important at that time, but also the personal growth and the overcoming of the challenges, like learning Swahili and living in an area that had no running water and electricity and things like that. And in my program, there were a cohort of other international volunteers from the UK and Australia and the US, and all of the non-US participants were pre-university gap year students. And I became very interested in this concept that has been a generational norm in other countries like the UK and Australia about, taking this time out after secondary school, but before university, and having this intentional time out where you're exploring and traveling and working and experiencing the world outside the classroom. And when I came back to the US, I just became obsessed with this idea of why aren't we doing this in America? This would be so good for Americans to experience. And that concept was during this time. This is now, almost 15 years ago that I got into this work where, we were just starting to see, the college experience becoming increasingly out of reach financially, which has only gotten more intense over the past decade. We're starting to see college graduation rates fluctuate and underserved students really struggling. So there's just so many complicated aspects of the college experience this year at this time that I think that gap year can really help with in different ways. So that's kind of how I got into this work. And so I started gap year counseling in 2008 and have been doing it ever since. Yeah.
So you've sent many students to lots of different gap years over that time.
Yes. I don't know the exact number, but it's several hundred students at this point that I've worked with over the years. Yeah.
So you've given a slight definition of gap year. Can you give us a little bit more of, well, what is the definition for gap year?
Sure. So I define a gap year as an intentional period of personal growth supported by activities of enrichment and specifically targeting personal, practical, and pre-professional growth. So, I think that there's a lot of guardrails on that definition, but it's still broad enough that it can include so many different activities and geographic regions and modalities of educational experience. But it's really meant to be experiential learning and time on, where a student is really engaging with their interests in a real world environment.
So that's different than just taking time off from school.
Right.
That's one of the parents' biggest concerns when they hear, oh, my child wants to take a gap year, or it's being recommended by their counselor. I don't want them to lose momentum by taking a year off of school. So how do you combat that?
Sure. There's so many misconceptions about the gap year experience as far as why one would take one and what the usefulness of it is, as well as what it actually means. And I think that the easiest way to describe it to people who are newer to the concept is that it is not the absence of a choice. So the real differentiating factor between just graduating high school and working at, the local five and dime shop or something like that, and taking a gap year is intention. If a student is saying, I am taking a gap year to X, Y, and Z for my future, that's a gap year. If a student graduates without making a plan for their future, that's not a gap year. So I think that there's that intentionality that really marks whether they are going on this intentional path versus just kind of not fearfully, usually not making a choice about their future.
I think that's a great distinction to make, and that's something that we can communicate to parents and families and, you know, other people for students. I think a lot of times when students hear this concept, especially here in the United States, as you said, in the UK and Australia, other places it's much more normalized. Here you've been beating that drum for a long time, but it helps parents to understand the purpose and the reason. So have you seen the popularity? I mean, since you've been watching this over the last 15 years, how has gap year, students taking gap years, how has that increased?
Yeah, there's been a couple kind of watershed moments in the growth of the gap year option in the States. And I would say that, you know, one thing that's interesting is that a lot more people than we think take gap time, but they may not label it as such. And sometimes when I'm out talking at schools or in places where there's multiple generations, I might say to the parents, you know, who here, you know, took time after grad school and took a road trip for 3 months across the United States, or who went and worked abroad for a summer, or who did this or who did that. Those are all gap year experiences. And so many people have actually had those really transformative moments in time where they weren't quite in the workforce, they weren't quite in school, and they really light up when they start thinking about those memories. But to get back to the original question, can you remind me what the original question was, Cindy?
How
Sorry.
has the use of gap years increased over the years?
Right. Yes. So
Popularity
generationally, this has been happening for a while, but I think that in this kind of like the past, you know, 10 years or so, one of the first kind of entrances to the gap year into pop culture came when Malia Obama took a gap year. And so she announced it, I think it was 2016, and all of a sudden, you know, CNN and PBS and NPR are all calling up the Gap Year Association and consultants like myself and saying, what is this? What's she doing? Why is she doing it? And that really propelled that the use of the term gap year really pretty far forward, and that it became much more understood in a broader sense at that time. And then more recently, the pandemic really thrust the gap year into the spotlight, because a lot of students did not want to go to kind of this Franken college situation that was happening at that time. And so they took gap years kind of out of necessity. But then what's been interesting that's happened since is that a lot of those kids, their friends or their younger siblings, saw what those students were able to do, even in the context of the pandemic, and said, I would like to do that too. And now that the world is open up again, we're looking at the kind of pre-pandemic world of options again, which is really exciting. So, you know, these kind of things that have happened over the past 5 to 10 years, in conjunction with these economic forces of the rising cost of college and people reevaluating the ROI of the college experience, have really all come together to really increase both the recognition of the gap year as an option and also the popularity and more people taking it.
Do you think that Gen Z is more attuned toward doing this as well? I've talked with Dr. Corey Seemiller about her research in Gen Z, and, you know, they are coming from a different place and a much different perspective, and they are very realistic oriented. So you find that appeals to them, this concept of doing a gap year? Does that feed in?
Yeah, I think so, but not for necessarily the reasons so I'm a millennial, and the reasons that my generation were taking a gap year were more around self-exploration and adventure. And that's what we wanted. We wanted to go like fling ourselves really far away and go skydiving and go, you know, volunteer like I did and just have like a really unique experience. And what I'm finding with Gen Z is that they are more practical. They're saying like, and they're a little bit more anxious about their future because of all these other things that are happening in this moment. So they're saying like, okay, a gap year is a tool. It's a tool that I can employ that will help me understand more about what I want out of post-secondary education. It'll help me clarify who I am. It'll help me get more out of whatever experience I choose to do. And so they are more level-headed, I think, about why they're using it, but then they end up doing kind of the same array of experiences and getting excited about it once they discover all the things that are out there for them.
So what are some of those things, Julia? What are some of the things that students can do as part of their gap year?
Yeah, this is always where the adults who are listening are going to start trying to like look at their bank accounts and see if they can take their own sabbatical. But I think that it's really important for people who are newer to this idea to understand that there's really an endless array of options out there, but they all boil down to two basic categories. There's programmatic experiences that are structured, contained, that are run by an organization or entity that helps keep a participant in that experience and held throughout that experience. And then there's what I call self-designed gap year opportunities. And these are things that are independently designed and executed by the individual. And so things that are in the programmatic category would include experiential semester programs like Knowles or Where There Be Dragons, where a student is in a cohort and they're traveling or they're doing outdoor exploration, something like that for a few months. Internship programs where they're actually placed and housed together with other interns and doing work experiences, volunteer programs, national service like AmeriCorps, things like that, that are kind of in this more contained, kind of a contained experience. And then the self-designed things can be anything like, backpacking through Southeast Asia, working on organic farms in Hawaii, taking on a personal project. I've had students who've written their own one person plays and produced them at a local theater, working locally or interning locally. So all of those things that a student just thinks about and has the wherewithal to do can be a part of a really enriching gap year experience.
I agree. And I think that's a good distinction to make, that it doesn't have to be an organized activity or something you pay for to have it be a very valuable contributory type of gap year.
Precisely.
How do the colleges look at this?
So all the admissions officers and people at the college level who I talk to about gap years have a really positive connotation about gap years. And there's been a lot of studies done at the collegiate level about the outcomes that they see on campuses. Bob Claggett, who was former Middlebury Dean of Admissions, he did some really great studies at Middlebury where he actually looked at traditional students compared to gap year students and their GPAs. And he actually found that gap year students, and this is when you're controlling for every other factor, the gap year students performed better academically and graduated sooner than the traditional students. So, and so we tend to see that people who know that well-spent gap years produce more mature and students who are college ready, they really like the idea of a gap year, but they also recognize that not all gap years are created equal. So they really, when a college is thinking about whether they are accepting a deferral letter from a student, they are going to be looking for that intentionality, that sense of purpose, and what their plan is. So I think that kind of well-designed gap year plans are really crucial in how a college is going to see a gap year.
Yeah. And that's the key, that students make that decision. They still go through the application process. And then once they've got their admissions decision and where they want to enroll, then they submit a letter, a deferral letter, as you said. It's like, okay, I want to come to your school, but I want to go do this gap year first.
That's right. Yeah.
So what if they change their mind after they've done your gap year? They don't want to go back there. This is a case study I actually have in my class. So what has your experience been with that?
Yeah, and this can definitely make an IEC's job harder, right? If they halfway through their gap year say, "Oh, I've discovered I want to be in the mountains and not in the desert, like my school that I deferred to is from," or they choose another course of study that's not offered at their future college. So, and this is also where I definitely lean on the expertise of people who are more in college admissions, because I do not do any college admissions advising. I'm like very niched down into my gap year world. But from what I understand, the best practice is if a student is promised to a certain college and they know for sure that they're not going to go there, then if they're currently in their gap year and they've made that decision and it's still kind of before the deadlines for that next cycle, they could rescind that. They could get in contact with their college that they deferred from, take out their application, and then reapply to colleges that year, and then see where the chips fall in April again, and then they'll have another set of choices. And that's the ideal situation, so that you have the most choice. But, some other students may, if they think that they might change their mind, they also may not apply senior year, and they may wait until their gap year to apply to schools and then make that decision, in the April, May time of after they've had all these gap year experiences. But that's kind of what I've seen as the best way to do it. But what do you think?
Yeah, and they've made this commitment and they've made this promise, but life changes, and colleges do know that there's a yield, and so it's definitely something they know is a possibility. So a student should not be compelled to go to a school after a gap year, even if things change. But what I also find is I don't have that many students who do that. I don't have that many students who do gap years, but I have had some, and sometimes they'll do the gap year and then they'll come back, because trying to apply to colleges while they're in the gap year is difficult. So then they end up with another year off, because then they come back and spend that next year going through the application process, which is fine, because then it just makes them another year more mature and ready to go to college once they get there. So what should we, as counselors and advisors, and in my UCLA class, we have people who are in international schools, public, private, all nonprofit groups. So how do we evaluate the quality of a gap year? We get all these emails and things that say, send your kids here, have them look at this. So what should we be looking for?
Yeah, well, I guess to back up even further, I'd encourage everybody to talk about gap years alongside college admissions. When you're actually starting to work with students, say, and that actually helps with normalization of the gap year option, to say, I know you're college bound, and there's also this idea that you could take a gap year and we could work that into your college plan. And here are the reasons why you might want to consider taking a gap year. And then, once they actually get more into the process, then you're really thinking about what is going to be like the overall, reason and core of their gap year opportunity. So as an IEC, you're not expected to know about every single program or opportunity that's out there, but what you can walk a student through is a goal setting exercise, and those 3 P's that I mentioned before: personal, practical, and professional. That is the best way and the easiest way that I've found to help people coach a student through that initial planning process, where basically they put a couple goals down in each of those categories. The personal stuff are the hobbies that they truly, genuinely want to pursue, not to get into college, but just because they want to make time for those things or try something new. So that's what goes in that category. The practical stuff is going to be the life skills, budgeting, independence building, social skills, anything like that they need to work on and want to develop during their year. And then the pre-professional stuff is going to be the career exploration that they could pursue during that year that might help them solidify or explore their course of study. And I mean, that's where the magic happens, because if you can imagine, like, what would that individual look like after a year of all 3 of those things being exercised in different capacities, you're going to end up with a much more mature, confident, student who's really ready to take advantage of their college experience. And that's what I feel like our society hasn't fully really looked at, is like our students are clearly not all ready for college, especially after the pandemic, and seeing a gap year as a tool that's available and really can be utilized by every single student is a great methodology to kind of consider in your own practice. And so that's kind of a framework, but then the actual, like, is this a good program? Is this a, crapshoot program? I would say that the easy button for people to kind of educate themselves is to go to the gapyearassociation.org. The Gap Year Association is kind of the accrediting body of the gap year space. And so they accredit counselors like myself. They also accredit gap year programs. And I can say, because I've sat on the standards committee and helped vet some of these programs, that the level that you have to go through to get to be a Gap Year Association accredited program is it's a very in-depth process. So that's a special seal that you will see, and you can actually kind of isolate out which programs on their website are fully accredited. And if you want to recommend programs that have kind of met best practices in the industry, that's a really good shortcut so that you can kind of cross-reference who you're getting emails from with, are they Gap Year Association accredited? And it's not like all Gap Year programs are either good or bad based on that accreditation, but it is an easy way to see that a program is really committed to high quality programming.
Well, and that's very comforting to know that there is an association. I do have links and, point to that through my course. But I think also it will give parents comfort to know, and they can go and see things too. Because as you said, you can't visit them all or vet them all yourself. So it's nice to know there's an organization that has done that.
Yeah.
So I love having the 3Ps. I think that's a really nice way to construct and organize and communicate that. Is there anything else that we should know as counselors, or words of advice that you would like to share, Julia?
Sure. Well, I think the other thing that you all can think of as counselors too, if you're talking about gap years, is that most students do multiple things over the course of their gap year. So when we talk about gap year, sometimes people are like, okay, I need to find one thing for the whole year, but really most students break it up by almost like academic calendar year. There's usually a fall semester thing. A lot of students will come back home from whatever they're doing for the holidays and then go off again and do one or two more things before the following summer. So thinking of a gap year as an opportunity for, 2 to 3 different experiences can be really useful as well, because then you can see which goals are those experiences going to check off, or which anchors are we going to be tackling through those experiences. And then also the progression. So sometimes a student might come to you and say, I really want to go surfing in Sri Lanka or South Africa. And the parent might be like, oh my God, that sounds like way too much for me. And so that might be way too much for the day one, minute one of a gap year. But after a set of more structured experiences, maybe that's the kind of last thing that they do. That's the cherry on top of their year that they've earned through these other experiences that are more structured or more educational, or exercising goals in other ways. So when they're thinking of how to put together the year, they should be thinking about this natural progression of more structure and more support, and then building towards more independence and more autonomy as the year goes on, or sometimes more challenge geographically or physically, that kind of thing. So thinking about starting point and then moving towards more things as the year goes along.
I think that's very wise advice, and it does help us, give us the right frame of mind. It's not an all or nothing type of thing, that you can put together different experiences. So
sure, yeah. And it's a lot of fun.
it is. And the growth that you see is just tremendous. So, well, Julia, thank you so much. This has been so informative, and just really helps to dispel some of the myths and the concerns about gap year. So it's very much appreciated.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Cindy. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome.